Hey everyone, I just want to welcome you to tonight's class. Tonight we're going to be talking about a really cool topic. It's a topic that a lot of people would love to know more about. It's encountering animal signs when you're out in the field or out on the forest and you find something that you know was left by an animal, but you're not exactly sure what left that. And so our class tonight is it's a spin-off of a previous class that we taught about 7 to 8 months ago called Animal Tracks. Now tonight's class is called Animal Signs, and literally we're going to be talking beyond tracks. And so we might mention tracks here or there, but for the most part what we're going to be talking about tonight are animal signs. You know an animal has left that particular sign, whether or not it's a place where they were feeding, or it could be something they left behind. Tonight's class is designed to teach you to make better guesses as to what animals have left that sign. So with that, we're going to get started with tonight's class. I am your instructor for tonight. My name is Daryl Radijak. I'm a wildlife biologist. I'm a large carnivore specialist, but I also deal with a whole bunch of other animals. And so to get started with tonight's class, usually what we do with every Wildlife for You webinar is the instructors give a little bit of background just so the students know that they're receiving really good information about wildlife. This isn't just someone who fly by the seat of their pants talking about wildlife. All the instructors at Wildlife for You have a boatload of experience. So for those that don't know me, I do have my bachelor's degree in wildlife management. I graduated from, it's the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, which is a mouthful. It is the longest college name in the world, and that's a true story. But I did get my degree back in 1992, so that kind of dates me. It tells you I'm an old man. But what I did is, after I received my degree in the early 90s, I started working with wildlife. And one of the first jobs that I had was managing a place called the Appalachian Bear Center in Townsend, Tennessee, just outside of Great Smoky Mountain National Park. And the Park Service, the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency, they used to bring me orphan cubs that we would raise, take care of, and release back to the wild. Did that for about 5 years. And then I started working for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency as a wildlife biologist. Because of my experience at that bear center, I was soon promoted. I became the big game coordinator for the state of Tennessee. And so I was managing all the bear, all the deer, all the elk, all the wild hogs in the state of Tennessee. Did that for about 7 years. The director saw something in me and he promoted me to become chief of wildlife for the state of Tennessee. So instead of being over those big game animals, I was over all the animals in the state of Tennessee. Did that for another 5 years. And so I've dabbled quite a bit in all sorts of different animals, all sorts of different management topics. And so it was a wonderful, wonderful job. But as a little boy, always wanting to live and work in the Rockies or out west somewhere, and the furthest, when you work for the state of Tennessee, the furthest west you could go is Memphis. And so I moved to the Rockies about 3.5 years ago, and absolutely love it. And I've been doing these webinars for the last couple of years. So I will tell you that anything that you see here on Wildlife for You, this is science-based. This isn't anyone's opinion. This is the leading science that is out there. And so whenever we have a tough topic, we're going to the science journals to find out the best answer for you guys. So with that, let's get started with tonight's presentation. So we're going to be talking about animal signs, and I queued it up a little earlier, where these are going to be things that you know an animal has passed before you, not exactly sure what has left that particular sign. And so what I want to do to start off, I want to kind of change your way of thinking about what you encounter and what you see when you're out in the forest. And so I put this picture up there. You can see there's something a little unnatural about that photo. You can see where the trees have been cropped a little bit on the bottom. And you know something has done this. You don't know exactly what it is. And so oftentimes right away, whenever we encounter some type of visual cue that an animal has left a sign for us, we start thinking, what animal can it be? And the problem with that thought process is there are literally hundreds and hundreds of different animals. And so I want to kind of rewire your brain. Instead of going directly to thinking what kind of animal could have done this, I want you to kind of take a pause and start rethinking it. Because like I said, when you encounter some strange sign, there's a whole host of animals, from mammals to birds to you name it, that could potentially leave that sign that you're looking at, and it becomes quite the nightmare thinking of all the different possibilities. And so what we want to do is stop thinking about the animals first. If you encounter something in the forest and you're trying to figure out what has left that, don't automatically start thinking about the animals first. So the first thing I want you to do, get that animal thought out of your mind first, and I want you to focus on what you're looking at. So soon as you encounter whatever it is, whether or not it's disturbed vegetation or something that is left behind by an animal, or anything that looks out of the ordinary, just take a step back and start deciphering what exactly you're looking at. Because there's only a couple of different possibilities right out of the gates. And what this is going to do is going to create a systematic way of trying to figure out what animal has left that sign for you to figure out. So the first thing you're going to try to figure out is that thing that you're looking at, is it the home of an animal? Or is it the shelter? Is it a place where this animal resides or rests throughout the day? Another option, besides a place where an animal stays for a period of time, it could be where an animal has eaten, or where an animal eats routinely, or it could be just a one-time event. Is this something that you're looking at where the animal has been feasting on something? Another option that you could have before you is you're looking at something that is showing you where an animal has traveled, some type of path that is left behind by the animal. We're not talking footprints yet, but it's just some travel path for the animal. Another option you could have is a signpost. There's a number of species that could leave a marker, and it's not left particularly for humans, but it's left for them to warn or alert other animals of their species, even other animals of other species, of their presence. So it could be some type of signpost or marking spot for those animals. And then last but not least, it could be something that the animal left behind for you. And usually whenever we're talking about that, we're talking about scat or poop or whatever you want to call it. And so there's only a couple of different categories. So the first thing, whenever you encounter this object that you encounter in the woods, just try to figure out what it is that, what's the function of that particular object that you locate. So here's the thing. Once you know what you're looking at, whether or not it's the travel path or the bedding area or some type of scat, you can then narrow down the choice of animals that left it. And so right away, you see some type of den, or you see some kind of scat, and immediately you see the size of that. You can automatically eliminate a whole bunch of things. For example, if you see something extremely small, there's a whole host of animals that you could rule out. So you don't have to go through the whole mind-boggling list of all the animals it could be. But here's something that's really, really important. And I can't stress this enough, and I've seen it quite a bit in my field, is you have to be mindful of the animal ranges. And I will tell you, we simply don't have enough time in today's class to go over each and every species, where it's found, all the different behavioral aspects of each species. That will be left up to you. I'm hoping to teach you the process of elimination that you go through in your mind when you encounter these animal signs. But one thing that you'll need to do on the side is become familiar with animal ranges. And here's what I mean by that. There are a number of animals that are Western kind of species. And I'll use one that I shouldn't use it because it always strikes a chord with some people. But for example, cougars or mountain lions, they're primarily a Western species. And so if you're sitting there somewhere in the East Coast and you find some scat that appears to be feline, you should not, knowing the ranges of these animals, you should not go to an animal that is not found in that area. So try to become familiar with the animals within that area. Likewise with the eastern western stuff, if you have a western or a southern species, for example, maybe a gopher tortoise or something that's found in the south, and you're way up in Canada, obviously you're not going to be thinking of some of those southern species. And so just be mindful of what animals are in your area, and try not to think, because automatically some people will see something and they'll assume it's some animal from far, far away. And the odds of that happening, don't want to say they're 100% non-existent, but they're extremely, extremely small. Oftentimes when you have an animal that's in a location that it's not supposed to be, it's usually an escaped pet of some sort. So just become familiar with your animal ranges and know what's typically found in your area, and that is going to drastically reduce the number of animals that you have to go through whenever you find this animal sign that you're wondering about. So what evidence is out there? What are these animal signs that I'm talking about? So let's go through some of these things. So I started with homes. These are places where the animal may rest, or could spend most of the day, could spend most of the year. These are places where the animal returns to periodically to seek shelter, so to speak. Obviously, we know all kinds of nests. And for the most part, when we're talking about nests, we're talking about bird nests. And bird nests come in all shapes and sizes. And like I said, I'm not going to have time to go through all the different species of bird nests and teach you what is what. But nests are obviously one of those places where when you encounter those, you know exactly what animal is coming there. It's some kind of bird, but figuring out what kind of bird that is. But having said that, a nest alone will give you cues. For example, that nest on the left, you know it'd be a medium-sized bird. You encounter a nest on the right that is on a huge platform, you know it's got to be one of the larger birds. That here in particular, this would be an osprey nest. But just based on the size alone of the animal sign that's left behind, you can tell what it is. This is one of my favorite pictures. Many of you that follow me know that these hummingbirds, these were black-chinned hummingbirds that nested on a light bulb in my backyard. But just based on the size of the sign, you can deduce. For example, if you know it's some kind of bird nest, you can eliminate a lot of options to go through just based on the size of that nest and what it could accommodate. Now, whenever we're talking about nests, we're not limited to birds. Oftentimes we're in the woods, we see this clump up in the trees. It's not always a bird. And so understand that there are some mammals that will build nests. In particular, squirrels are notorious for building nests. Obviously, gray squirrels will commonly build in these deciduous trees, or these trees where the leaves fall. But you do get squirrel nests that occur in pine trees that typically don't fall. Oftentimes red squirrels will construct nests in pine trees. They favor pine trees. A few different species of squirrels will favor one kind of tree or the other. And again, I can't go through all of those in tonight's class. And obviously another kind of nest that we hope not to see or run into or disturb is insect nests. So there's all sorts of nests out there. Just understand when you're looking at it, typically bird nests have that open top to them. Not all of them, but typically they'll have that open top. Squirrel nests tend to have just a conglomeration of building material that appears to have a roof and everything else. But there's other places that animals can tend to call their home, or where they sleep day in and day out. Not throughout the entire year, but maybe for a season or two. And so oftentimes we may encounter ground dens. Now ground dens, it's oftentimes very difficult to tell you exactly what is denning there unless you see it. One of the greatest tools that we can use today is using trail cameras. So if you find a ground den, an opening in, whether or not it's into the side, underneath a tree, into a cave, anything like that, you can tell that it's an opening where an animal has excavated and is living in there. The first thing you could do is base your thought process on size. Just like the bird nest issue, based on the size of the opening, for example, this picture here, if this opening is 2 or 3 feet wide, you know it could be a large animal. You could have a bear living in some type of ground den such as this. Obviously, that would be a ground den for the winter time. But as the opening or the size of that den shrinks, the possibility of what kind of animal is living in there also shrinks. So obviously, something like this could be for a fox or a coyote. You might have an opening that's only maybe a foot, foot and a half, maybe 2 feet wide, much smaller opening. Typically, a bear wouldn't be getting into there. And then it just gets smaller and smaller. So obviously, the size of the ground den, just like the bird nest, will dictate what kind of animal is going to be using that particular den. Another thing that you may encounter on your hike, and especially anyone that lives in the East Coast, we have lots of large ungulates, and I'll use that fancy word. We've got lots of deer all over North America. Western species of deer include mule deer and elk, but on the East Coast, we are loaded with white-tailed deer. And one of the things the deer do throughout the day is they'll lay in a daybed. So sometimes you may be walking through the woods and you find this area of grass that is matted down. You don't see the deer or anything, but you know something has been there. And if one of the key characteristics here is just the size of it. Y'all know how big deer are, and so when you find this large oval type of depression where the grass or whatever vegetation is all laid down, oftentimes that's a deer bed that you may encounter. Like I said, you may never see that animal, but just based on knowing what's in your area and the size of the animals that could possibly leave that gives you a good clue as to what it is. Now the cool thing is in the wintertime, when a deer stays in one spot for a long time, if there's any type of snow cover, their body heat will usually leave that impression. And so quite often time you'll be walking through the woods if there's a fresh layer of snow, and like I said, you'll never see these animals because they detect you coming from a long ways off and they leave that area, but they leave signs that show you exactly where they're laying and what they're doing. All right, only one particular animal that will create a lodge. They're one of the greatest ecological engineers we have out there, but there are some animals, or at least one animal, a beaver, that obviously if you see a structure built in a stream or on a lake, everyone knows what a beaver lodge looks like, but this is another type of home that you may encounter. But here's something that many of you may not think of, but if you spend any amount of time on the water, you can encounter something, and I wish the birds weren't in this picture, but every once in a while you may encounter an island or a stretch of trees along a river system that are literally dead or dying. They look awful. It looks like someone sprayed some herbicide and just killed the trees. That is actually sign that's left behind. Can anyone guess, I'm going to quiz you here, can anyone guess what kind of birds typically do this? They're roosts. They all roost together, and usually when they occupy these roosts for a long time, the vegetation dies out underneath them. Does anyone know what kind of birds? It's in that picture as well. It's not a great close-up of those birds, but does anyone know what those are? Those are not buzzards. They're water birds, if that's a hint for anyone. Nobody? Cormorants. Cormorants are, they're actually a growing concern for many state wildlife agencies because their numbers are like, I don't want to say they're growing out of control, but they're definitely much higher than they were historically. And they're creating these dead zones where all these birds roost there. The problem is their urea or their defecation is really, really acidic. And so when you have multiple birds roosting in the same place day in and day out, they tend to kill all the vegetation underneath. So something cool to look at, but that's another place where an animal tends to rest or just a temporary home for them, so to speak. Yeah, Jan, and I shouldn't say that's restricted just to cormorants, but this goes into what I was saying before. Know what birds are in your area, And then you can easily, as soon as you have a good feel for what is found in your area, you can identify those individual species that are leaving those particular signposts behind. All right, another big thing that you can look out for is when you're out in the woods, you can encounter places where an animal has eaten or tends to eat periodically. It could be something that they're doing day in and day out for a number of days or a number of weeks, or it could be a one-time event, but it's just some sign that you find left behind by an animal that shows you where they have eaten. So let's start with something simple, and let's look at what they're eating. Because as soon as, remember, when you walk up to this sign, whatever you find, you don't want to start thinking of the animals. You're trying to decipher what exactly are you looking at. So if you're out in a field, obviously the east has tons and tons of vegetation compared to the west, but if you're in this big grass field and you see a part of it that's mowed down, you know some animal has moved in there and have eaten there, right away you can start eliminating a whole host of animals that would not be eating grass. So you could focus your attention on what types of animals will eat grass. That narrows down your thought process tremendously. Likewise, if it's an area that there's a lot of forbs or these broadleaf plants, there's specific animals that will be eating the broadleaf plants. Obviously, deer will eat grass. They'll also eat a lot of these forbs. But there's specific food items that you'll find that eliminate a whole host of the possibilities. One that is probably the broadest of them all is acorns. If you see where an animal has been feeding on acorns, I hate to tell you this, but you might be SOL. Sorry for the French, but everything loves acorns. I shouldn't say everything, but so many animals, forest animals, from bears to deer to turkey to coyotes, lots of different things will eat acorns. It's one of nature's powerful packets of nutrition. And so acorns are a tough one because there's so many different species that feed on acorns. But I'll quiz you here. Say you come across a log that is torn apart and you deduce that something was eating grubs. It's pretty obvious that there's only a few animals that will tear apart or even have the means to tear apart a log to get at the grubs. And so it's literally, like I said, we're reversing that thought process where we're trying to figure out exactly what's going on first, and then it leads you to that answer really, really quickly. And last but not least, the good old carcass. Obviously, if you come across a carcass of some sort, whether or not it's a deer or a rabbit or anything, there's only a few animals that are true carnivores, and so it's much, much easier to determine what animals left that sign before you. So again, a lot of this has to deal with knowing the animals in your area, what they feed on, what their range is, but as soon as you see that sign, it all starts falling into place. All right, here is another really cool thing with finding a place where an animal has fed, is you can start looking at how they are eating it. And what I mean by that, all right, let's take two animals. Let's take a cottontail rabbit and we'll take a deer. Both of them will browse on vegetation. What I mean by browse on vegetation, during the winter time, there's not a lot of fresh, juicy green leaves out there. And so their gut kind of changes and they convert their diet mostly to browse, which are twiggy stems, much more, can't think of the word, much higher fiber, but they're able to digest this. And so they're able to survive the winter by eating some of these twigs that are still left poking up through the snow. And so if they're going to be eating the exact same food items, so if you have a couple of small shoots of maple trees that are shooting through the snow and both a rabbit and a deer will eat that, can you tell the difference to see what animal has browsed on those maple shoots? And believe it or not, in some situations you can. Based on the way the plant has been eaten, you can actually pick up some signs, or you can pick up some evidence that will tell you whether or not it was eaten by a rabbit or whether or not it was eaten by a deer. If you look at um, letter A, and you see those shoots there, it literally looks like someone came by with shears and they clipped those branches off with some type of scissoring type of action. And it makes sense because you look at a rabbit's mouth, they have those upper and lower incisors. And so when they're biting on a branch, it is literally that shearing action, and they're clipped extremely cleanly. Now the deer, on the other hand, might be feeding on the exact same kind of vegetation, but if you look at a deer's mouth, it looks a little weird here. They only have bottom teeth in the front. They don't have top front teeth. That's actually like a soft palate up there. So they only have that bottom row of teeth. And so when a deer bites some type of twig or stemmy material, it literally has to rip it off. And so looking at the ends of the vegetation, you can easily tell whether or not it was chewed on by a rabbit, because it'll be cut cleanly, or if it was ripped off and torn, odds are it was browsed on by a deer. So really cool things that you can pick up here and there. What you're going to have to do is start collecting these and storing them in your vault about all the different things that will give you clues to determine exactly what animal has left the sign before you. And then lastly, I believe this is the last section about the food that they eat, is what kind of food cache is it? And let me explain what a cache is. Just think of a Tupperware bowl. It's somewhere that they'll store their food so they can eat it at a later time. Not all animals do that. Some will never cache food, but there's definitely some animals that will cache food. So for example, squirrels. This is a crazy, insane food cache from red squirrels. They'll store nuts, they'll dig up the soil, put the nuts underneath, and they have these huge areas where they just have all these nuts stored. This is another thing. If you see on the right, that picture there is obviously a covered up carcass. This is usually indicative of some type of feline, whether or not it's a bobcat or a cougar. And obviously, depending on what part of the country you're in, you can deduce what's most likely to leave that type of food cache. And this is my favorite. I put it up in the quiz on Facebook the other day. It's some kind of food cache because they're literally coming back to eat it at a later date. Does anyone know what left that? I gave it away on the Facebook post yesterday. Does anyone know what animal has left this behind? Somebody had to see the Facebook page. I think this is one of the coolest things. I think it's kind of freakish though. But oftentimes especially if you have barbed wire or if you have any type of thorny bushes around, very medieval, yes. Believe it or not, that is left behind by this beauty. Yes, Tim, very good. Left behind by a shrike. Gorgeous bird. Their numbers are declining, unfortunately, but they have this tendency to impale their meal. So whether or not it's an insect, a beetle, a grasshopper, this picture here, that shrike has impaled a small snake that intends to eat. The one that blows me away, because I don't know how it intends to eat it, is here's a shrike that impaled a little mouse or a vole that it had captured. So the more you know about the individual animals and their behaviors, and you encounter these signs, you can start picking them off right away. So really cool things to think about when you're out on the forest or out on a hike and you encounter these things that just seem completely out of the ordinary. I'm going to pause here just for a second so I could read Jan's comment. Yeah, and one of the things that I mentioned earlier is one of the most useful tools, and I don't know if Melissa Grant's not on tonight. Using a trail camera is wonderful, because I will tell you right out of the gate, I'm a wildlife biologist, been a wildlife biologist my whole career. There are lots of things that stump me. I'll be on a hike and I'll see something that looks out of place and I know an animal has left it and I just have no clue. One of the greatest tools that you can use nowadays is trail cameras. And so, especially if you know if it's a frequent area that's being used by a particular animal, it is one of the funnest things to do is to set up a trail camera so you can go back to capture that animal to see exactly what is leaving those signs behind. Okay, I'm going to move on. So, going past the places that they eat, sometimes we see signs left behind by animals of where they have traveled. And so some of them are really big. When you look at some of the larger animals, whether or not it's bear, deer, elk, obviously these larger animals are going to leave visible tracks or visible trails in which they travel. And I will tell you that animals are very, very much like humans. Oftentimes they take the path of least resistance. So they're not going straight up, straight down, although they can with ease. Oftentimes they're working the contours because it's a lot easier working or walking along the contour. And when they're walking the same path over and over and over, you start to develop what we call these game trails. These are trails that the animals use constantly, and it wears a trail in there. Really easy to see. But it's not always the big animals. What's really cool is the smaller animals are doing this as well, but typically we're not down on our hands and knees looking for this. But sometimes the situation or the conditions are just right. And so this was a wonderful picture I came across that showed the mouse tunnels that occur underneath the snow. And they're there in the grass. And it's amazing if you get down on your hands and knees, especially if you're in a riparian area. I'm sorry for that word. Riparian area is like streamside area. So whenever you have water, flowing water, it is just a huge draw for all sorts of wildlife because all wildlife need water. And when you get down on your hands and knees and you get close, even in the grass, you can oftentimes see the trails from these smaller critters. It's just that usually we're at 5 or 6 foot elevation with our eyes, and we're not at their level to see the trails that they leave behind. And it doesn't always have to be on the ground. You can have some of these trails in some of these marshy or wet areas. This was one of the photos from my Facebook quiz the other day. This is a canal that's kind of trenched there from a beaver. And if you attended the lecture that we taught last month on beavers, myself and Stephanie Dennis taught that one, they'll design these to make it easier for them to transport some of the branches or twigs that they cut. So they construct road systems or canal systems to make life easier for them. So that's a really cool thing that shows you where these animals have traveled. Now we will move on. Does anyone have any questions about where they're eating, where they're traveled, or anything like that before I move on? We've got a couple more things. And then what we're going to do, which I think will be really cool, we're going to test you for a good portion of this. Okay. Now, understand, I mentioned it earlier when we were getting kicked off here that some animals will intentionally leave signposts or markers as a means of warning other animals of their species or other animals not of their species of their presence. Generally, it's the former. Generally, they're trying to communicate with other animals of their species. But these signposts or markers are really, really cool to find when you do find them. Sometimes they're difficult to find. One of those that you see quite a bit, and there's a couple. Does anyone know what this is here? Usually they're on trees that are only a couple inches in diameter. Very, very good. It is a deer rub. And usually you see these once a buck, everyone knows that the male deer, the bucks, will grow their antlers in the summertime. They're in velvet. And once that velvet begins to shed and that animal then becomes in hardened horn, it will rub its antlers on trees. It does it for a number of reasons. Some people will say it's trying to get the velvet off, but a lot of times their testosterone levels are increasing during the fall, and they'll do these fake sparring matches. If there's no other deer around, they'll kind of beat up a tree like this. And so these deer rubs are a great indication that there's a buck in that area, using that area. Now, some people will say the size of the deer rub will tell you how big that deer is. That tends to be true in one direction. What I mean by that is if you have a very large tree, say you have a 6-inch diameter tree that's all tore up, odds are it's tore up by a bigger buck. However, when you look at small trees that are all tore up, that could be tore up by a small buck or a big buck. And so if it's a big tree, it tends to be the larger buck, but if you find a small tree, you're not exactly sure what has done that. Now here's another sign. Does anyone know what this might be? Again, this is something that you would typically find in the fall. And believe it or not, this too is left by deer, and typically male deer. This is called a scrape. And so if you're out in the forest, usually around, typically on the East Coast, between the month of November and December are the peaks of this. But the male deer, that is the mating season for them. And so what they'll do is they'll find a spot on the ground and they'll make this scrape. And so they'll dig it out. It'll be a clearing anywhere from 1 foot wide to sometimes 3 feet wide. And they keep that area open, kind of in search for does that are receptive, for does that are coming into heat. And so this is something that's really cool. If you've never seen this before and you're walking through the woods, this is a signpost marker from a buck that's looking for a doe. Oftentimes he'll pee in it, a doe will pee in it. That's kind of like the area that they're marking to let each other know they're there. When the doe pees, that generally tells the buck whether or not she's ready, depending on the pheromones that are released. But it's really cool. If you don't recognize this, you would walk right by it and not even realize that an animal has come before you and left that. Yes, Jan. The doe will pee in it. Generally, what's really, really interesting, a lot of people get excited about the does coming into heat. When the does come into heat, it's called the rut, and that's when it's usually an intense couple of weeks. You can tell when the rut is in the peak, the deer rut is in the peak, really, really easily. And it's unfortunate, but all you have to do is drive the highways. Whenever you have the peak of the rut occur, whatever state you're in, generally you see more and more deer getting struck by vehicles. And so you can literally tell when that is occurring based on the number of deer vehicle collisions. And if you were to go for a walk in the woods around that, especially right before that rut takes place, you'll see these rubs, you'll see these scrapes all over the forest on the East Coast. Okay, what other kind of signpost markers do we have? Anyone guess what kind of animal could have left this? This is one of my specialties. In case you haven't guessed, if you look closely, you find a large tree like that, especially if it's all marked up, going up to that 5 or 6 foot level. Oftentimes, if you look closely, you'll see hairs stuck in the bark. If you do, that's almost a positive indication that it's a bear signpost. And so bears, for whatever reason it is, obviously they're leaving their scent. They can tell what other bears has come there because their sense of smell is just so powerful. But they have these scent marking or these marking trees throughout the forest. It might be difficult to find, but if you do find one, it would be a wonderful, wonderful place to put a trail camera up, because it's just so interesting to see these bears, all these different bears come into one location to mark a tree just to let the other bears know that they're in their territory. All right, now we're going to hit the home stretch. What they left behind. And so let's start with some of the easy things. When an animal leaves something behind, literally a body part or a present, quote unquote, for you, some of the things are really easy to figure out what they are. Now, obviously, if you're walking, you find a feather. Again, I can't go through the individual species identification for all of the different kinds of feathers, but typically, if you find a feather like this, obviously it's a sign left behind by whatever species of bird has dropped that feather. But what if you find a situation like this, where you find a whole slew of feathers? is this a sign of potentially a ruffed grouse was there? This may actually be more of a sign that potentially a bobcat was there that had captured that ruffed grouse. And so that the whole, remember, we want you looking at the whole scene of the crime, so to speak, to figure out what's going on. And because all of those feathers are there, from tail feathers to downy feathers, you know that that bird did not have a really good time there. And obviously it just doesn't have a heart attack and pull out all its feathers. It was attacked by another kind of animal. And so you have two different, you have feathers in both situations, but two different signs of different animals that left the feathers. And the one thing I will tell you, and this is something that I'm not a bird guy, and I never really thought of it much, but just recently I started helping another biologist doing some bird surveys, and we were looking for the nest of some of these birds. And typically the nest may be difficult to see, so instead of always looking up in the air to try to find the nest in the tree, the biologist I was working with, who was fantastic, was looking on the ground just as much as she was up in the air. And what she was looking for were signs of the nest being up above. For example, downy feathers. Now they won't last on the ground long, especially if it's rainy or windy. But if there's an active nest, these downy feathers oftentimes come out of that nest routinely. And so she finds a lot of the nests simply by looking for signs on the ground below that area. Okay, I'm going to quiz you again. Does anyone know what that is? And I will tell you it's not, it didn't come out of the back end of an animal. How about that? Very good, Jenny. Jenny, that was awesome. If you've never seen or played with owl pellets, they're the most fascinating things I have ever found. I was fortunate enough, back when I lived in Tennessee, there was a large oak tree that was inhabited by a great horned owl that left owl pellets for me all the time. And what an owl pellet is many of you know owls and other raptors feed on small mice and other mammals, and they swallow them whole. Now they'll digest all the gooey parts, but oftentimes they can't digest the bones and a lot of the hair. And the animal or the owl's body will hold that stuff until it's time, and it'll regurgitate and spit out what is called an owl pellet. And it consists of all the bones of all the little critters it's been eating. And so these are absolutely wonderful tools for an elementary school class that is learning about owls or birds, because you can dissect these things and find mouse skeletons and skeletons of all different sorts of animals, frogs, you name it. So they're really cool thing left behind by owls. And all sorts of owls will leave these. Depending on the size of that owl pellet can tell you pretty much what kind of owl it is. A really big pellet obviously would be a great horn. A smaller pellet obviously is going to be a much smaller owl. Jan, yes, typically they regurgitate these things every so many days, even possibly so many weeks, depending on how much they're feeding. But yeah, it'll just be one at a time. They'll hold it in their crop for a while before they release it. And they spit it out. They cough it up, and then typically they lean out of their nest and spit it out. So at the base of a tree, if you find a bunch of these owl pellets, you know that an owl is nesting higher up in that tree. Okay, this one is super simple. Obviously, a deer has left behind the antler. But now we're going to get to the fun stuff, because not everything is a body part that's easily identifiable. And what I mean by the fun stuff is we're going to talk about poop for a little bit, because this is one of the most useful animal signs and most often found animal signs out there. So we're going to talk about Scatology 101. Don't worry, I won't spend too much time here. But one of the first things you need to do is whenever you find a pile of animal poop or excrement, right away the size of it is going to dictate what kind of animal could possibly leave it. Something as big as this that you see can only be left by really large animals. You're not going to have a coyote or a smaller creature leaving a pile that big. So obviously you're leaning more towards bears or those much, much larger animals on the landscape. Whereas you get a smaller type of pellet, such as this. You see how small it is compared to the penny. This gentleman just wanted to put them in his hand. Obviously, this is going to be left behind by a much smaller animal. You're not going to have a large bear or an elk or anything like that leaving such tiny pellets, and they can get much smaller. So right off the bat, the size of the pile of scat tells you a tremendous amount of the potential possibilities of what kind of animal it could be. Next thing you might want to look for is the shape of the scat. And so there are certain animals, for example, carnivores, or omnivores in particular. What they're going to be doing there is going to be, well, put it this way, the carnivores is more tubular, so to speak. An omnivore might be very loosely formed, might be a big blob. But typically what you see with herbivores is they have a really powerful digestive system. They have this 4-chambered stomach that really processes their food, because you have to understand, deer, elk, some of these other rabbits, some of these herbivores, they're eating a ton of vegetation, cellulose, really, really, really hard to digest. So they have these souped up digestive systems that not only regurgitate the food on the inside, but they also have these bacteria in there specialized to help break down cellulose. So they have a really refined factory to digest that really difficult to digest vegetation. And so the back end of a lot of these herbivores is these pellets. It's like this finely processed digestive system. So when everything's all done, it's coming out in these pellets. So elk obviously will have big pellets, deer, white-tailed deer, a smaller pellet, rabbit, even smaller pellet. But for the most part, you can tell herbivores because you have a lot of this pelletized type of scat before you. Can anyone guess what kind of animal this excrement is from? No one? Okay, well, this comes from a bird, but this is where I say shape is really cool, because the more you learn about individual species, especially if the species interests you, by all means, explore, dive into, and learn as much as you can. This is actually the poop from a turkey. And what's really cool about this is, based on the shape, you can actually tell if it's a male or a female. And so the 5 on the left-hand side that are more rounded or circular, those are from a hen turkey, where the ones on the right-hand side, the 4 on the right-hand side that are more tubular or J-shaped, those are from the male turkey, the gobbler. And so the shape can sometimes not only tell you what kind of species it is, but what sex that animal is. Yeah, Jan, that's a really thing. It's amazing the amount of information that poop can tell you. In fact, my next slide will actually go into that. I say texture, but what I mean by texture is kind of like the ingredients. Looking to see what's inside the poop, and I know this might gross some people out, but you don't always have to play with it or spread it out to see what's inside. Obviously, this scat here, you can see berries in there. You know right away that whatever animal has left this behind was probably some type of omnivore. This particular pile here was left by a bear. And so looking to see what's inside is really, really useful. And so if you find a piece of scat like this, tubular, has lots and lots of hair, one of the things that's going to tell you is this kind of animal that left that behind is more likely than not to be some type of carnivore or has a highly carnivorous diet. They're eating other animals, they're digesting this hair, they can't process that hair, so they're passing that hair out their body. And so the texture, the consistency, what that scat is made of often tells you exactly what animal has left it. Might not tell you exactly, but it gives you a strong hint of what kind of animal has left it. And then taste. No, I'm just kidding. We're not going to go into taste of the excrement. I had to put something in there to make you laugh. Okay, I think, let me see how I'm doing here. All right, doing pretty good on time. So what I want to do, remember, when you're out in the woods and you encounter something that you may have never seen before, it it doesn't serve you just going animal by animal trying to think what it possibly could have left at. So kind of piecing together the scene, trying to figure out exactly what you're looking at will serve you best. So in this brief time, I've only been talking to you for about 45, 50 minutes. This brief time, I want to quiz you. And so this is where you can get your typing fingers ready, see how well you do. Just to give you an idea, and I will tell you, don't expect to get everything right, because like I said, I go out there all alone. I've been working with animals my whole life, and I find things that I cannot decipher. And so that's obviously when I'll put a trail camera up or try to figure out what left it. And so the cool thing is when you can figure it out, or at least you can narrow it down, it is the most powerful feeling when you're out there knowing what animal or potentially what animal has passed before you. So, something like this. What would you all guess? Obviously, this is where an animal has traveled, and I will tell you that is some type of lawn. So that's not really tall grass, that's pretty short grass. So what would you guess kind of animal has left this trail here? Yeah, obviously it's some kind of burrowing animal, depending. Now, Bet, you mentioned a gopher. The gopher, remember, you have to remember where those animals are located. And so typically if you're in the east, you might think more of a mole or something there. If you're in the west, some of these pocket gophers that live out west. So it all depends on what kind of area you're in. But obviously, yes, this is a subterranean tunnel for some kind of small critter. Okay, this is one that I think is wonderful. I'll give extra credit to to whoever can guess this. So the first thing you see here is that all the dirt is turned up. Tim, you get the extra credit. But what you're seeing a large amount of disturbance here. And what it is rooting behavior from some type of large animal. In fact, it's probably not even a single large animal. It's probably a whole pack of them or a whole herd of them. And this is some of the damage that is caused by wild boars. They'll come into an area and they're rooting around for grubs, trying to find some roots, and it literally looks like a rototiller has been brought to your yard. And so when you see this, right away you can deduce, obviously it's a big animal, obviously there's probably lots of these big animals, and so you can narrow down what the possibilities are. So fantastic guess, this is wild hogs or pigs. Okay, what I'm trying to show here is, okay, this is probably an eastern forest. You can see that the area is scratched up. The leaves are kind of pushed aside or moved to the side. Can anyone guess what might be kind of digging around, like either looking for grubs or maybe acorns even? Deer is a good guess. Oh, very good, Jan. Because I was going to show you, this will really give it away. That's a turkey feather. But turkeys are notorious, especially if you have a big flock of turkeys that coming into an area, and they'll scratch out. You'll just see the leaves scratched out everywhere. Oftentimes what they're looking for, whether or not it's acorns, they'll be looking for small grubs if they can find it, any type of small vegetation, new shoots that have popped up. So they're coming through and more or less, I don't want to say they're leaf blowing, but they're scratching away the leaf litter to get to that bare soil. Yeah, and that's a really good point, Melissa. Oftentimes you'll find some animal sign that you cannot narrow it down to it can only be caused by this. There could be a number of animals that lead, especially when you have some holes dug in your yard. There's usually a slew of culprits it could be. And so anyone that comes in, and there are some would-be professionals that will come in and tell you exactly what you're seeing. And if you encounter that, just let the spidey senses start tingling, because nobody is that smart or intelligent to know exactly what's going on. like I said, I've worked with these animals for a long, long time, and it's a guessing game in many, many situations. All right, what potentially could be living in this type of ground den? This is exactly, yeah, this is exactly one of those things you really can't know for certain, but it's probably not going to be a bear. It's going to be probably too small for a bear to use. So you're looking at animals from, it could be a fox den, could be a coyote den, maybe even a bobcat could use it occasionally. So you really won't know. This is a great opportunity for you to put a trail camera over, but it's probably one of those medium-sized predators that are out on the landscape. But what if you saw that same size hole, but instead of it being on the ground, it's way up in the tree? Got a couple of different options there. You could have, well, yeah, an owl can live there. Very good, Jan. Raccoon, you could even have a possum that lives in there. And so just understanding where something is located, what size of the cavity it is, it really narrows down the possibilities that it could be. All right, another one. The reason I put this one up in here is to really hammer home the point of knowing the geographic range of animals for you to consider. If you find some type of excavated hole like this, for example, if you're on the East Coast, possibility there could be a groundhog, or what we call a woodchuck. Very similar type of hole. Now you take that exact same looking hole and you move it out west, could be a pocket gopher, could be a badger. You have to know what animals are in your geographic area. And so don't be thinking of really strange animals that typically aren't found in your area. So if you're in the East Coast, don't think it's a badger or anything like that. So like I said, knowledge is power. Knowing more and more about the animals in your area will really serve you well. Whoops. Okay. Claw marks in a tree. Possibilities. What do you think could be? Very good. Yes. What I want you to look at here is the size of those claw marks. And so that's pretty deep. Bears can scratch up trees very, very deep like that. So obviously this is left behind by a bear. But here are claw marks as well. I think this is, it actually looks like a telephone pole. But something like this, you could be dealing more with squirrels. It could be a raccoon. And so just basing your decisions on what you're looking at really hones it down for you really, really quickly. Could be a cat. Very good, Jan. All right, we saw these before. I won't even wait for you. These are deer rubs. All right, what animal do you think left this sign? We'll give it away. This is a fruit tree. I'm sticking with North America, just so you know, Jan. Bet I imagine you meant to type bear. Yeah, bears can cause quite extensive damage to orchards. They'll get in there, they'll smell the tree, or the fruit in the tree. They'll get up there. It's amazing when you go into Cades Cove, you can often see the trees where bears have been feeding. Cades Cove, for those that don't know, is this wonderful place in the Smokies. Tons and tons of bears. But after the spring and summer, you'll see all the trees that the bears were feeding in, because bears are kind of lazy in that they'll climb up into a tree, and instead of, well, they're smart too. They don't want to go to the end of the branch where it might not support them, so they'll literally break the branches and bring the fruit or the acorns or whatever they're feeding on, they'll bring it to them. And so oftentimes you'll see these trees with all these broken branches, and the broken branches are still up there. That is really proof positive that it's a bear feeding up in that tree. Elk, I don't foresee, elk probably are not eating many apples. Primarily elk are what we call grazers. They're eating the grasses. Obviously they will dine on some of those, but for the most part, I imagine the elk would be eating them on the ground. I don't think they're going to go through the trouble of breaking branches to get more of those. But typically, one of the big differences between elk and white-tailed deer, elk are more grazers, so they eat more of the grasses. White-tailed deer focus primarily on browse and some of the forbs. They don't eat as much grasses as elk do. Jan, that could be a possibility. One of the things you have to worry about with elk, or even with white-tailed deer with orchards, though, is when they're rubbing their trees, they become very pumped up with testosterone in the fall, and those big male bull elk will tear apart an apple tree, not so much to get the apples, but it's just one of those things that they will spar with. That's kind of like this previous picture of the deer rub. If they do that with a small apple tree, they can cause quite a bit of damage. So I can understand where they could have concern of elk coming into an orchard. Okay, who can figure out what this is? This is one of those things you might not have ever seen it, but you could probably figure out just by remember looking at the holistic scene instead of just going through animals that could leave it. Very, very good, Laura, Cindy. Cindy and Greg, that's a good guess too. I would guess here though an otter. Typically, the otters are notorious for sliding on their bellies, and so you see the slide mark of the whole body, and their feet will kind of cause the propulsion. Beavers may do this, but they typically don't slide as far or as long as an otter, so I lean more towards otter on this. But fantastic guesses there. This is a thing where you may never encounter that animal, but just putting two and two together will really help you out. Obviously, this is a beaver. I won't explain much, threw that in. Okay, now think of the scene as a whole. What you're looking at here. What could possibly have left this? Yes, good observation. That's why I put this picture in there, so you can key in on the shingle roof. Because remember, you're wanting to paint the picture of what was going on beforehand that could have left this. Due to the size of that, Laura and Bet, that excrement is probably much too large for a squirrel. Very, very good. Yeah, and so after a while you'll get a good feel for the size of the scat that's left behind. Some things are going to be way too big for some of these smaller rodents, and so you just bump it up. But the shingle here tells you obviously it's an animal living around some urban environment, and the size of that, it's up on someone's roof. It's too big for a squirrel, so more than likely, in fact, it was left by a raccoon. All right, what do you think you're looking at here? Possum, that's a good guess. I think possum are a little bit smaller than that as well. Can anyone tell me what's going on in this picture? What created that distinct line in the leaves? It's not a deer path. This is what we call a browse line. And oftentimes, and this is funny because in my world, in the biology world, especially the deer biology world, this is something we look at. We walk into a forest and right away we know things are out of whack, whether or not there's too many deer. Because what you're looking at there is a browse line. The deer can only reach so high. They'll stretch their neck, so you're looking at a browse line about 4 or 5 feet high, and they can't reach any higher than that. And they will literally eat every leaf from that 5-foot level down all the way to the ground. And that's literally a sign that there's not enough food in that forest to feed all the deer that are there. And so these browse lines are really indicative of an unhealthy system in which the deer are eating more food than what's available. And the bad thing with this, and this is one of those things about trying to keep populations in balance. If you have an overpopulation of deer that are eating every living piece of vegetation from 5 foot down, what do you think that does to ground nesting birds or some of these other smaller creatures that also need that vegetation that's either on the forest floor? And so these are some of the things that wildlife biologists think about, because we're trying to manage for diversity, for as many wild species as we possibly can. And if you have an overabundance of one species, it can really cause negative impacts on other species. Yeah, the herbivores are notorious for creating browse lines when their numbers get out of control. That's why I'm a huge fan. I know people hate me for it, but I'm a huge fan for predators. I think cougars and coyotes and bears and all those other fun stuff are awesome for keeping nature in balance. But a lot of people just love seeing deer and want to see as many deer as possible. Okay, taught this already earlier in today's class. What do you think would have made that type of animal sign? Rabbit. Very, very good. Like I said, it looks like someone took pruning shears and just came by and clipped that vegetation off. Okay, what would be your guesses as the kind of animal that would leave something like this? Right away, I hope you can see that there's lots of hair within that scat. Very good, Trish. I don't know. It depends on what part of the country you are in, but this is definitely a feline. Well, I know it was a feline, but it could potentially, if you saw this, you know that their diet is going to be small mammals. They're not digesting the hair, so it could be canine, could be feline. I do know this one is, in particular, is feline, but depending on what part of the country, if you're in the east, more than likely you would lean towards bobcat. In the west, you could have bobcat, you could have cougar. If you're in the far north, you could have lynx. I have heard that and I have seen that, but I've also, and I'm responding to Jan right now, more of a Tootsie Roll. Yeah, I've seen quite a bit of examples of that, but I've also seen where it doesn't look exactly like it's supposed to look. And you'll find that quite a bit, even with bears. Bears will knock out some strange-looking excrement from time to time. Melissa, yes, fox scat does have hair in it. You have to remember that those canids, whether or not it's foxes or coyotes or wolves, are oftentimes eating very small predators. Mice, voles, rabbits, squirrels. They're not doing a good job at digesting the hair. And so you definitely will see quite a bit of hair material in those mesopredator scat piles. Mesopredators, kind of medium range predator, middle of the road. Okay, let me describe this one because I think you're really going to start to be proud of yourself for kind of looking at this holistic view. What you're looking at here is the middens and the remains of where an animal has been feeding, and it actually has defecated there as well. But this would typically be found along a river's edge, and it contains lots of fish scales. What do you think could have left that? In fact, I think you can see the skeleton of a fish in there too. Very, very good, Laura. I used to have to do otter surveys in Tennessee a couple of times, and this is what we would look for. We'd just cruise along the river's edge, and you'd find these spots where these otters would be catching these fish, and they'd come along the side, they'd eat them. It was very consistent, and you would just find these piles where you'd see all these fish scales. There's proof positive that otters were feeding in that area. You guys are doing awesome. Okay, once again, I'll just call it right off the bat. This is bear again. But one of the things that I wanted to let you know is, remember, keep in mind that geographic range. So obviously, this is going to be bear sign. If you're in the northern Rockies, besides being a black bear, this could also be a grizzly. In fact, these are grizzly claw marks. So depending on your geographic range, you have different species to potentially be worried about. Jan, no, it's not so much that they're doing it at the same time. They just have these kind of like community feeding areas. Maybe not a community, but consistently feeding in the same area. So they'll swim in the pond or the river, they'll catch the fish, and they'll go to the same area where they're going to eat, and oftentimes you'll find these scales all located in the same area. Okay, almost done, I promise. I hate keeping you so long. I put this slide in here to, if anyone's interested in like just learning more and more, every once in a while you might come upon a carcass. And one of the things that we wildlife biologists will look at a carcass is try to determine what had killed that animal. So there's different types of, the more you learn about it, there's different types of bite patterns. And so when you're out west and you're dealing with elk or some of these mule deer and you find a carcass laying there, you can look to see where the killing blow had occurred. For those that followed the swap program that I did with the students, we went in on that fresh elk carcass, and you could see at the base of the skull of that elk, you can see where the offending animal that took that animal down took it at the base of the neck. That is typically indicative of a cougar or some type of feline. They usually go for the throat or the neck. They're trying to kill that animal quickly. You have to understand cats are single hunters, and they're oftentimes much smaller than the prey they bring down, so they're looking for a quick kill. So they go, I like to say they go for the jugular, but oftentimes they're trying to break the base of the skull or suffocate that animal as quickly as possible. Wolves, on the other hand, or canines, are oftentimes pack animals. And so instead of being this sprinter type of quick kill that a cougar is, the canines, whether or not it's wolves or coyotes, they will often hunt in packs, maybe not really big packs, but they'll tag team and they'll team up on an animal. And what they're trying to do, instead of going for that quick kill, they wear that animal down. And so oftentimes you'll see bite marks on the hind end where they're trying to eviscerate the animal, really wound it, really hamper it. And so just looking at bite marks on a carcass can tell you a really good picture of what kind of animal brought that animal down. So, all right, moving on. Last but not least, these are the animal signs you hate to find in your house or in your cabin. Little mouse turds, but I wanted to end on that one because it's something that we're all good at identifying. You don't realize how good you are, but just knowing about wildlife, knowing the different aspects of what they're eating, how big they are, y'all can do awesome identifying these different animal signs. And so go back and rewatch Animal Tracks, Animal Signs. Next time you're out in the woods, I think you'll find yourself much more comfortable making determinations about what kind of animal has passed before you. And so with that, I'm going to summarize here. Whenever you encounter anything, could be a track, could be animal sign, just think about what you're looking at. Don't just start going through the encyclopedia of animals. Piece together the scene before you. So what are you looking at? Are you looking at an animal's home or its den, something they were eating or where they were eating? Is it their travel route? Is it a signpost? Is it a piece they left behind? As soon as you learn to identify that and to narrow down the choices it could be, you're going to become much better, much more comfortable making those determinations. And so the key here, I can't teach you, I've already kept you way longer than I should have, but knowing the animal's behavior and rate, it's going to take a lot more classes that I probably can't teach you all. But if there's certain animals that interest you, learn as much as you can about them, about their behaviors, their diets, all the different things. Next time you're in the woods and you encounter that particular animal that has passed before you, you'll be spot on making that determination really, really quickly. And I'll get to your comment in a second, Jan. But I talk about this all the time here and on Facebook. Knowledge is power. Not only is it power, it's confidence. Confidence in hiking outdoors, confidence in making determinations on what you're seeing before you. And with that, I'm going to thank you for sticking with me for an hour and 15 minutes. I do have to give photo credits for a number of people that I got some excuse me, I got hiccups now, got the photos from. For those that don't know, I'm sure everyone here knows, you can register for these classes on our website, wildlifeforyou.com. The easiest thing to do is follow us on Facebook or Twitter. Trish Stevens does the Facebook account, or the Twitter account. I do the Facebook. We're always talking about upcoming classes, and we'll provide links where you can register there. But just so you know, coming up, mark your calendars. If you haven't signed up already, I'm really looking forward to this Sunday. This is probably the most anticipated one from my end. But we're going to be talking about bear encounters, overcoming your fears. And what we're going to do, we're going to feature a whole bunch of different videos for you to dissect, figure out what the bear is doing. Without a doubt, it will make you more comfortable in a situation where you see a bear. When you can identify what's going on with that bear and what your best course of action, you become much more comfortable having these encounters. You don't really want to, but you definitely feel more comfortable. Then the next one after that is Eat or Be Eaten. It's all about predator-prey relations. Like I said, I'm a huge fan of those apex predators. And then another one, which I think is going to be really cool, it's going to be about camouflage. I love this photo. Just so you know, there is a snake smack dab in the center of that photo, which I don't think I could leave the picture up there long enough for everybody to find it. But it is amazing how well some of these animals can blend into their surroundings. So you want to sign up for any of those. We do have the 3 class packages available. But with that, I'm going to tell you this is the end, and that answers that question of whether or not a bear poops in the wood. And so I'll stick around and answer any questions or comments you have.